Hey everyone and welcome back to a new video. So we've just found out what's going to be inside the new Warhammer 40,000 9th edition Indomitus box, and I won't surprise you when I say that I am ecstatic about what we've seen so far. The models look spectacular, and once again I think the community team outdid themselves with the final reveal, specifically the new Invader ATV and Firestrike servo turret. It's getting quite exciting, I have to admit. But all of that said, there's one new model that I particularly want to look at a bit more closely, and that's the Space Marine Judiciar. The reason being that it's not only an incredibly cool model, probably my favourite in the entire Primaris range so far, but it also seems to have some rather ominous ramifications when it comes to the lore and the future of the Space Marines. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to spend a few minutes looking over this new hero unit and drawing out some of the design elements and influences that really strike me. And let's start with how Games Workshop introduced the model. Following the first 9th edition preview event, we got to see a few of the new Space Marine Primaris units, including the Primaris Assault Intercessors, the Primaris Blade Guard Veterans, and the Primaris Outriders. And then towards the bottom of the article from the Warhammer community website, they revealed the new Judiciar by saying, someone has to keep all of these new Space Marines in line though, right? Someone to execute the orders of the Chapter Masters, or, you know, just execute dudes in general. That's this guy. Now, I don't know about you, but I did a bit of a mental double take when it even suggested the notion that these new Space Marines needed to be kept in line. We're talking Space Marines after all, they shall know no fear sorts of heroes, and at first I figured this was just a tongue-in-cheek reference to make out how tough he is. And then I started to think about how Space Marine lore has developed over the last few years, and more recently in the Psychic Awakening series, and actually we have seen moments where Primaris Marines have come at odds with Imperial authority. One of the most obvious examples is the recent War of the Spider short story Consequences, which saw two full companies of Brazen Drakes Grey Shields declared traitors by the Adeptus Custodes when it was discovered that their chapter's homeworld was in a state of open rebellion. As a side note, this story follows on from the earlier one called Burden of Brotherhood, which shows the Brazen Drakes chapter, these being normal Astartes, struggling with their own psychic awakening, and it's the guilt-driven obligation to purge their own chapter that pushes them over the edge, leading them to become a renegade chapter. Now, when Consequences was published, there was a big discussion in the community about who was right and who was wrong. Should the Custodes have executed the newly arrived Primaris Grey Shields simply due to association with the Brazen Drakes, or should they have been given a chance for redemption? Was redemption even needed? Unfortunately, I'm not going to try and answer those questions here, but I do want to point out that both stories go to great lengths to make 2 points very clear. Firstly, the Adeptus Astartes, the non-Primaris version that is, are becoming more and more susceptible to mutation along with the rest of humanity. And secondly, there is a great deal of distrust and tension, not just between the Custodes and the Astartes, but even between normal Astartes and their new Primaris brethren. We can see that from the fact that the Adeptus Custodes and Sisters of Silence are even needed to ensure that chapters accept the gift of the Primaris into their ranks. It's clear that some chapters don't want them for one reason or another. Now, I'm not entirely sure if the mutations we see with the Brazen Drakes are due to their gene seed or some other aspect, but it's the fact that the Grey Shields share their gene seed to some extent with them that ultimately condemns them. In the eyes of the Custodes, loyalty is at least somewhat genetic, and actually they themselves are an excellent example of that being taken to the extremes. Loyalty is so inbred and perfect that it becomes blind and inflexible. But the reason I'm bringing all of this up is that it shows how perceptions of Space Marines have changed recently. They're not the black and white loyalist heroes we thought them to be. There's much more grey mixed in with them now, figuratively and literally, and I think that offers a particularly interesting setting for the Judiciar, and a rather more ominous role for him to play. And to explore this further, I want to take a closer look at the model itself. Now, arguably this character's standout feature is the incredible Executioner relic blade he's carrying across his equally broad shoulders, and there is some historical pretext for a weapon like this. We know these sorts of blades were used as early as the 16th century, and they're designed, as you would expect, for executions. The lack of a sharp point makes it rather ineffective at stabbing enemies, but the length and weight of the blade, particularly towards the end, makes it really efficient at chopping, much like an axe is. Now, we also get a strong sense that this blade is following that tradition thanks to the inscription on the blade itself. We can make out the word terminus on the top, which is also a 16th century word evolved from Latin, which means a final point in space or time. And underneath I can just about make out the word ultimare, which originates from the Latin word ultimus and means come to an end. We actually get the word ultimate from ultimare's past participle, meaning something has already come to an end. Given the design and purpose of the sword, these inscriptions are certainly fitting. But the blade isn't the only executioner motif we see on this model. We have the dark shrouded appearance and the masked face, both of which also help to conjure the grim visage. But what I want to suggest in the rest of this video is that while Games Workshop is using this executioner design to create a hero who, on the surface, seems to be justice incarnate, there's also a wealth of other motifs that suggest that his role is far more morally ambivalent than we might first think. For instance, let's turn to that skull mask. Now, Games Workshop love putting skulls on their models, as do many of us in fact, and when they're used in the manner they are here, it not only strengthens the grim dark aesthetic, but also helps to establish that thin divide between life and death. Another great example of this is the Lord Relictor from the Stormcast Eternals range. In a loose sense, they're like chaplains in 40k, but their role is largely to keep the souls of their brethren firmly tethered to Sigmar and the Celestial Realm, and to guide the souls of those who fall back to the heavens for reforging. In general, they're spiritual guides, literally and figuratively, and their mortis armour, more specifically the mask, help to illustrate their place on the thin boundaries of life and death. I think the same can be said for the Judiciar, who certainly helps to bring people across that boundary, even if it is slightly more one way than in Age of Sigmar. But what strikes me is that this isn't simply a skull mask, it's also deliberately obscured with this brown face covering, which implies that the character doesn't just want to be menacing, but he also wants to be somewhat anonymous. Now, going back to the executioner motif, it's actually a myth that executioners used to wear hoods over their faces. Rather, executions were carried out by professionals who would openly travel as part of their job, and they were rather well known for it. However, the myth still remains, and in more modern depictions, we often show them with hoods as what I believe to be an expression of guilt. Now, despite the fact that this is a fictionalised depiction, I still feel that Games Workshop is deliberately leaning into the myth here. Space Marines don't often hide their faces in the manner we see here, as if they're some bandit in the Wild West, and that makes me think that they also want to subtly convey some of the ramifications of those mythical depictions. To put it bluntly, I think the Judiciar wants to convey a sense of guilt in his role, a reason to shield both his humanity and his identity, at least in gesture anyways, and that might make sense given what we know in the lore. We saw in Burden of Brotherhood how the mutations affecting the Brazen Drakes could strike at any time, even in the midst of combat. What if there was an individual who needed to quietly watch over the other Astartes for that particular reason? An individual who may need to carry out the Emperor's mercy on people who called him brother, all while their other brethren watched on. To look at it another way, in Consequences, Shield Captain Tyvar of the Adeptus Custodes is fighting one of the new Brazen Drake's Grey Shields when he says, "I am Custodes, I speak with the Emperor's voice. Were you loyal, you would set down your weapons and accept your guilt, but you side with your brothers before your Emperor, as the Adeptus Astartes always have." Now, I love this paragraph, not only because it's a great mic drop moment, but also because it reveals an attitude at the top of Imperial hierarchy. Whether it's because of the Horus Heresy or situations like this, maybe both, the loyalty between members of the Astartes, the bonds of brotherhood within a chapter, are now seen as a double-edged sword, and one that risks cutting the Imperium as adeptly as it does its enemies. And remember, he's not just saying this to a regular Astartes, but a Primaris. They're all the same in Tyvar's eyes, and all need to be viewed with the same level of distrust. With all of this said, and given the incredible influence of the Custodes in the Imperium's leadership as guardians of the Emperor himself, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to consider that Judiciars may quietly hold a role similar to the one Tyvar ends up adopting in the story. In the Imperium's darkest hour, with everything hanging by a thread, they need to ensure that beyond anything else, the Astartes remain compliant and don't again fall short of the duties asked of them, even if that includes taking on their own or subjecting themselves to higher, more paranoid powers. And I don't know about you, but the Burden of Brotherhood story gave me a real sense of inevitability to the Brazen Drake's fall. The mutations in their chapter arise again and again, despite their rather blunt-force ritualistic attempts to cleanse it, and it's that realisation that they can't escape their fate that leads them to make their radical choices. To put it bluntly, despite triumph after triumph over the Imperium's greatest foes, it's time itself that finally overwhelms them and leads them down a path that they never dreamed they would follow. And that fact becomes increasingly intriguing when we look at the hourglass symbols that ordain a couple of the Blade Guard heroes, including the new Primaris Captain. Now, looking at that model specifically for a moment, it was confirmed on the Warhammer community site following this weekend's preview that these skeletal remains embedded into the shields of the Blade Guard veterans are in fact the remains of Imperial Martyrs. And if you think about how martyrs are portrayed historically and in today's society, they're often depicted bearing items of significance in their lives, usually a religious text. But here the martyr is, much like our Judiciar, clutching an hourglass. Now, there are a number of ways to interpret why an hourglass is significant for both models, but I want to suggest that two are perhaps more pertinent. The first is that in the 41st millennium, the Imperium's war is one of survival, not conquest. The sweeping expansion of the Great Crusade is behind them, and the Indomitus Crusade seeks only to reunite what was once whole. On a million worlds, martyrs like the ones we see revered here give their lives so that the Imperium can go on for one more day, so that it can breathe one more breath and hope to fight again with the next. In that sense, time is the greatest asset the Imperium can hope for right now. But similarly, as we see in the Psychic Awakening short stories, time can bring all manner of hazards. Mutation, corruption, decay. Time can wear down the Imperium as much as anything the galaxy can throw at it, and that's seen in how decrepit it's become since its glory days prior to the Horus Heresy. But even more finitely than that, time brings an infinite amount of tests, moments where mind, body and soul are stressed beyond their limits, and characters like Captain Geryon of the Brazen Drake's Grey Shields find themselves in a single moment faced with dire choices. Just like an hourglass itself, all of the infinite moments of the past and all the infinite possibilities of the future come together in a single grain of decision, a terminus if we think back to the Blade's Inscription, where the wrong choice at any moment will find you on the wrong side of justice, of Imperial authority no less, and eternally condemned as a result. Hopefully you're starting to see what I see with this model. It's a remarkably impressive sculpt, they all are frankly, but it also hints at so much more that we're already starting to see in 40k's story. Where the Judiciar clearly stands ready to swing the Executioner's blade, the symbolism it presents and the lore we're now discovering suggests that at whom it will swing is not necessarily as clear. But I just want to close by reflecting on the concept of the Blade Guard for a moment, because I think the imagery they use also offers a glimpse into how this culture of paranoia and distrust might be permeating and even becoming ritualised through the broader Astartes. The mark of the Shield Guard is most overt when it's emblazoned on the shields of their veterans, an image that is both stark in how it presents the sword as a shield in itself, and morbid in how it evokes the fallen when doing so. In respect to the latter, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, it adds a sense of emotional weight to the task of the veterans, as though the only way to honour the lives and sacrifices of the fallen is by picking up the sword themselves and continuing the struggle, as they would have wanted. But in respect to the former, I think the image of the sword embossed onto the shield harkens to the idea that the best defense is a good offense. However, if we take that one step further into the grimdark, what if I were to say that in order to protect something you treasure, its purity and its memory, you sometimes need to be ready to wield the sword against what it is becoming? Throughout this video I've echoed the connotations of the Consequences short story and how the War for the Imperium is establishing an entirely new ideological front. Here, this sword emblem seems to be a rationalisation of that, an Imperium on the offence, but also one that appreciates that the sickness in its genetics and darkest recesses can only truly be dealt with by cutting at least part of it out. Maybe that's slightly overreaching, but the emblem appears on many of the new Blade Guard models, which shows that it has a real significance for them, and I can't help but feel that the latent imagery implies a righteousness in their cause. We see that most strongly in how that emblem wraps itself around the model's hand, and its message melds with that of the hourglass so well. Having the ability and perception to judge the actions of others and to mete out justice is one thing, but it's not enough in this dark age of the 41st millennium. With everything resting on a knife's edge, that power to judge also needs to be coupled with the conviction that however justice needs to be served, and to whoever it needs to be brought, it is always in defence of a far greater cause, the sanctity and survival of the Imperium. So those are just a few of my thoughts on the Judiciar, and I have to be honest, I'm probably peering a little too far down the rabbit hole, but hopefully you can see why I'm drawn to looking at this model from this particular perspective, given all the recent developments in 40k's story. Either way, whether I'm right or wrong, I think the symbolism in these models is absolutely fantastic, and I can't wait to see how this implied storytelling develops across the rest of the Space Marines, Necrons, and other 40k races in fact. But let me know what you think, not just about this model, but also about the swathe of models that we've seen over the last few weeks. What are you going to be getting, and what plans do you have for the new 9th edition? Let me know the answer to those in the comments below, and I want to say thank you as always for watching. Please do consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel if you enjoyed it, and I do hope you'll join me for the next one. But until then, take care.